Thank you for calling Federal Bureau of Investigation Headquarters, Washington, D.C. Please hold while your call is connected.
Director Hoover speaking, and whoever you might be, I hope you understand that you're interrupting
Edgar.
I've already said that this is the director, and I shan't say it again. Now...
Edgar, Howard Hughes here, and I'm having a little trouble hearing you, Edgar.
Ah, quite, Mr. Hughes. I should have deduced that from the volume, and I shall endeavor to speak more clearly. And how precisely may I assist you today?
Well, Ed, let me get right down to it. Ed, it's high time to deal with the rat's nest of communist subversion and pornographic sedition in this so-called podcast industry. Now, I called you because the records department here is in a damn shambles. Not a decent Jew lawyer or Jew accountant from here to Quebec who doesn't have some kind of ties to Negro liberation or the Catholic crime syndicates, and you know I won't have any of that in my damn shop. So I need you to pull some records, see what you can find out about the podcasts I already own. Figure out how I might use them in the cause of the greatest country in the world.
To be quite frank, Mr. Hughes, I had an inkling that you might tender this sort of request in the near future, and I took the liberty of asking a few trustworthy men to look into your situation with the FCC.
That's darn sharp, Edgar. I knew I was asking the right man.
Indeed, Mr. Hughes, and I knew the right man would be asking if you can abide the implication of an eventual tit-for-tat.
Makes the world go round, doesn't it, Edgar?
It most certainly does. Now, I see here that you naturally own pieces of programs and conglomerates throughout the entire podcasting sector, but your major holdings include a 69% ownership of a program called Calm Town, the title and contents of which, I must confess, leave me baffled. Through Zenith Technical Enterprises, a CIA front in Miami, you own 85% of a certain Cabot Trap House, which, given its name and location, I must presume is some sort of bilingual Cuban-American mystery show or puzzle game, and therefore of possible use in the dissemination of encrypted anti-Castro messages and propaganda throughout the Caribbean. And, of course, you outright own 100% of This American Life, Fresh Air, the Hellbent podcast, and that is...
Spit it out now, Edgar.
Well, you see, Mr. Hughes, I hesitate because I must now answer your query with a query of my own. We have a broadcast license, we have papers of incorporation, we have a time slot and a radio frequency, but we have absolutely no information about the content or nature of a certain entity listed here as the Red Kahina Cast.
And neither do I, Edgar, but when I know, you certainly will too, because that particular property is going to go off like a megaton bomb. I can't tell you much because I don't know much, but the gal behind it is what we used to call a surefire 100-proof humdinger, and she won't let us down. Now, what about this death is just around the corner hubbub?
Hardly significant enough to make demands on our valuable time, Mr. Hughes. Death is just around the corner has, I should say, been useful in one way and one way only. It has proven something I frankly wouldn't have believed, namely that there are broadcasts too morally perverted and seditiously profane to be of interest even on the left.
Oh, yes, officer, but no, officer, but there's absolutely no need to investigate anything here or to ask any questions because, see, death is just around the corner. It's just sort of a fun group for very normal type of fun, type of extremely normal type of people, who like to get together and have very, very normal kind of fun. And so sometimes, being so normal as we are, we get carried away with how normal we are. And we wonder about, what it would be like to be not so normal, but only in a fun, normal kind of, still pretty normal kind of way. And so we get into what you would call what exactly are the words I'm looking for? I guess it would be sort of a hip, sort of a swinging, sort of beatnik type, a bebop type of scenario. And we start saying, what if this and what if that? But it's all just fun. It's all just conspiracy theories and alternate history, and certainly nothing that's proven, and certainly nothing that has been proven over and over again, and not designed as any kind of historical criticism that would make you see the whole last century differently. And nothing. It's just being normal, average, normal type of people. We like to give each other the creepy crawlies every now and again, being so normal as sort of a break from how normal we are, because, I mean, you look like a very normal man yourself, officer, and so, sometimes it's good to have a fun little break from being normal. And, I see you're leaving now, so thank you for your service. You look very normal today, officer. Puh. So is that all the cops? All right, then. We can get started with this. Death is just around the corner, number 71, if I am not mistaken. Third part of the John Kennedy series, and what I assume will become a running feature. Two little errata to correct from the previous episode. Number one, the name of the island from which Kennedy on PT-59 helped rescue those 87 Marines. I naively assumed, optimistically, which is very uncharacteristic for me, hey, it's an island in the South Pacific, it probably named in its native language, whatever that might be, or perhaps in some variants of one of the Asian language families. So it looks like Choiseul. Let's say Choiseul. I should have fucking known that, of course, it would be a colonial holding. Of course, it would be named after the Duc de Choiseul, a French aristocrat, Etienne Francois, whose main accomplishment, as far as I can tell, is having the fucking island named after him. So it's Choiseul, not Choiseul. And the other one, and I don't know why I always do this, I got it right the first time, but that guy, David Atlee Phillips, CIA agent extraordinaire, the man who would eventually become the handler or control for Lee Harvey Oswald, and also handled Antonio Veciana. His field code name was Maurice Bishop. And I said Maurice Bishop the first time, and then the other two times I made reference to it, I said Frank Bishop. I don't know why. I always think it's Frank Bishop. As far as I can tell, there's no other famous person named Frank Bishop or anything. But this is a mistake I'm constantly making. So I'm sorry. It's Maurice Bishop. And now, the meat of the episode itself. It's basically going to be JFK's presidency. How did this utterly middle-of-the-road, mediocre, liberal war hawk become a man dangerous enough for the CIA to want to assassinate and eventually to assassinate? And the answer to that is kind of two separate answers, namely that there is an outward, a public, what Thomas Pynchon would call a secular history to JFK's presidency, the kind of thing you would see on the History Channel. And then there is the inward one, the one that, if it had gone differently, would have changed things forever in this country, the one that had to do with how it is that American power is used and who has the right to use it and what it's used for, and ended with Kennedy and all of us losing. Now, in terms of the outward history, until the last 6 months or so of his presidency, Kennedy continued to be the, center-right, quasi-liberal Cold War hawk who had been elected. Same guy he was as a congressman and a senator. Same one who, was a vigorous proponent of the Truman Doctrine, that we have not only the right but the responsibility to stop the spread of communism from anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and who supported a bill that would have forced communists to register with the federal government. Just absolute horseshit. And who, as we discussed last time, helped gut the 1957 Civil Rights Act so that he could vote for the second version and say, hey, look at me, I voted for a civil rights bill. And most people wouldn't know, yeah, you also helped destroy a much better civil rights bill. That would change, even outwardly, in the last year or so of Kennedy's presidency, and there were a couple instances in which it was outwardly obvious that something had changed, even before that. But for the most part, Kennedy's public presidency was kind of a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You know, on the one hand, he and Bobby backed up the AFL-CIO when U.S. Steel tried to raise the price of its product without raising the wages of its workers. And just as a side note, can you fucking imagine any American president since then giving a shit about a corporation raising prices without raising wages? Especially a corporation that it was as big a fucking government contractor as U.S. Steel. God, that's just a relic of a bygone era. So, okay, real win for labor there. On the other hand, his brother Bobby, the Attorney General, and his continued obsession with Jimmy Hoffa and links between organized crime and labor, that helped not so much to create as to reignite the anti-labor, I was going to say stigma, but the better term would be hysteria, so notable in this country's history from, the late 1800s onward when fucking Pinkertons and company detectives were murdering labor leaders. Incidentally, if you're interested in this in a fictional sense, or I guess I should say a semi-fictional sense, John Dos Passos' USA trilogy will give you a much more visceral sense of what labor was up against in its early years in this country than I think most straight-up historical documents would. And of course, there's a lot about that in Pynchon's Against the Day as well, although there's so much other stuff that for your average reader, it might get rather overwhelmed. And then there was this brief period, the New Deal period, when labor unionism basically helped to create the middle class, along with FDR's reforms and programs. And then came Bobby Kennedy and the Teamsters. And whether he meant to or not, Bobby helped to revive that anti-labor hysteria, which has persisted persisted isn't even the word, which has grown and grown and grown hypertrophically in both parties since the 1960s, such that, the labor movement in the United States at this point has virtually no power. I mean, what are the powerful unions left? Fucking police union, right? That's basically the one. So on labor, overall. And until the last 6 months of this presidency, on civil rights, overall. Because, on the one hand, every photo op, every speech, he would say the right things about working together for progress to redress some of the grievances that the Negro has in this civilization. And at others would stall and hem and haw and refuse actually to sign anything, and employ the liberals' favorite tactic anytime there was violence of saying, now I think there are serious structural problems on both sides, and I don't think we can move forward at all until each side has cleaned its own house. Just obscurantist bullshit, basically. As I say, the last 6 months of his presidency would be different because John Kennedy knew he was going to die by that point. He, as a man who had survived, several near-death experiences in World War II, and had also grown up with, chronic disease and had acquired more chronic health problems as a result of World War II, and on more than one occasion was so sick that his family thought he was going to die. He was kind of preoccupied with death. And if he could have watched his own assassination, it would not have taken him by surprise. John Kennedy thought about dying a lot and did not expect to live to an old age. And as I've mentioned last time, even told his wife before the trip that took him to Dallas that he thought his time was coming, and he outlined a number of assassination scenarios, one of which turned out to be accurate for him, the other of which turned out to be accurate for Bobby. So that's, a quick pencil sketch version of the outward history. Now we have to talk about the inward history of the Kennedy administration, which is basically Kennedy versus the deep state, and in particular the CIA. And that started because of an event that most Americans know as the Bay of Pigs invasion. You see, Kennedy took office as a Cold War hawk, still, a Truman doctrinaire, still. More than ready to dispose American forces such as they could be disposed to get rid of someone like Fidel Castro after the Cuban Revolution. And he probably would have been made aware shortly after becoming the president that ever since 1959 and the first boatloads of Cuban exiles started showing up, the CIA had been sifting through those exiles for anyone who might be useful as a paramilitary. And the CIA had been operating training camps in out-of-the-way places like the Louisiana Swamp, for instance, through people like Guy Bannister and David Ferry. And we'll talk a lot about Guy Bannister and David Ferry in the next episode, which is going to be all about sort of the American of the 20th century, the American prototype of the last 100 years, namely Lee Harvey Oswald. So, by the time Kennedy took office, anti-Cuban momentum, especially within the CIA, was, raring to go. We talked at great length about Group 40 and Operation 40 last time. All this shit was in place. And less than 3 months after Kennedy's inauguration, the CIA brought him some kind of a plan for an invasion of Cuba and an overthrow of Fidel Castro. Now, what exactly the CIA said in that plan still has to be a matter of conjecture, because it is very clear from what happened afterward that Kennedy was, in his mind, told something very different than the CIA ended up doing, and that the CIA, in its mind, was betrayed by Kennedy. I'm guessing, given the CIA's long and colorful history of doing exactly this, you remember the Iraq War, it's a slam dunk, that the CIA told him, yeah, we've got this plan in place. It'll be quick, it'll be easy, it'll be slick, no major casualties, and, Cuba will be in American hands again. Just be us, just the people we've trained. Won't need much help at all from the military. Is not going to start, a world war. Is not going to occasion Soviet intervention. Naturally, they would have sold him on the ease and efficiency and speed of this program. So on April 4th, 1961, Kennedy agrees to some kind of clandestine invasion of Cuba. Then comes the actual Bay of Pigs invasion. And it's hard to talk about what the Bay of Pigs was, because it was a god-awful clusterfuck of several different overlapping plans. This is basically, CIA field day, getting to do a whole bunch of shit that they had been planning for years in collaboration with the mafia, often funded with drug money, both mafia drug money and their own drug money from the long history of CIA drug running that we talked about some last time. So the Bay of Pigs project, you could call it, lasted from about April 14th to April 20th, 1961, and involved a fake launch at one point and a fake landing to try to confuse the Cuban Defense Forces, and nonsense radio broadcasts meant to scare Cubans and to convince them that something enormous was coming. The CIA had done exactly the same thing in Guatemala in -- They probably broadcast from JM Wave, that huge Miami CIA station we talked about last time. I'm trying to remember. The two phrases I remember being broadcast into Cuba were, I believe, "The boys in the yellow house, the red-tailed fish are biting," which meant exactly nothing, but were supposed to sound to the Cubans like secret military orders. The implication, I think, being that they were secret orders to secret anti-Castro, pro-America, Batista loyalists within Castro's government and army, who were just waiting for the signal to turn on their own quote-unquote men. Those people didn't exist. We didn't have anyone there. But it had worked in Guatemala to scare the shit out of Jacobo Arbenz and his loyalists when the invasion force in Guatemala actually showed up. It was like 150 guys on the backs of some fruit trucks. It was nothing. If they had rolled into the capital that way, they couldn't have deposed shit. But the radio broadcasts and the, kind of fake guerrilla activity scared the government into escaping before they could be murdered, which was, probably a good plan. Because if that invasion hadn't worked, we would have probably engineered the kind of invasion which we did murder them. So we tried the same thing in Cuba, and it just doesn't work at all. And in the middle of this span, April 14th to 20th, comes the thing that most people mean when they say Bay of Pigs. On April 17th, the actual landing of the CIA's paramilitary forces on a beach in Cuba called the Playa Giron. Something I learned actually while researching this, that we call this event Bay of Pigs or Bahía de Cochinos. The Cubans call it Playa Giron because that's the actual beachhead in the Bahía de Cochinos where the CIA paramilitaries landed. Giron, as far as I could tell, is one of a dozen Spanish aristocrats named Giron because I don't think it actually means anything as a noun in Spanish. So a nice little, double image of colonialism there. Americans being repulsed at a beach named for a Spaniard in Cuba. And these armies were launched, a few people from Florida, a few people from Nicaragua, a few people we'd stationed in Guatemala, a force of about 1,500. And there were some CIA, officers or agents, and a whole lot of people with, CIA asset or contract agent histories. But the majority of the invasion force was disgruntled, exiled anti-Castro Cubans who had been trained at those, illegally financed CIA training camps. And they hit the beach expecting something like Guatemala, that, the people would rise up. You notice how we claim that in every fucking war? Well, we'll get in there, and the people will rise up to support us. And you notice how that's never actually happened? And, we thought the Cuban government would crumble and Castro would get on a plane and go to Russia or something. None of that happened. The invasion force very quickly realized that no one was rising up around them. They got lost in a coastal swamp and completely lost all sense of direction or where they were. They started getting shot at. They started getting captured. And then they called back to the little sort of makeshift CIA base that was running this thing in a little town in Florida called Opalaca and said, this isn't fucking working. And Opalaca got on the phone to the president and told him, we need the Army, we need the Navy, we need the Air Force, we need fucking aircraft carriers, we need cannons, we need destroyer ships. And Kennedy, one imagines, was sitting in the Oval Office shitting himself, thinking, they told me this was going to be an easy in and out, one night fucking arrangement, smooth as Guatemala, and now they want me to deploy the entire might of the American military against Cuba. And Kennedy, of course, knew that if he did that, it would probably occasion a war with the Soviet Union, which would mean, World War III and possibly the end of the world. So Kennedy said, basically, get fucked. I'm not sending the entire American military to back up your fuck-up operation. And the result of this was that about 140 of the CIA paramilitaries got killed. Well over 1,000 were arrested. Several hundred were executed after their arrests. And this all sort of went on awkwardly until the CIA, and we're talking years later now, like either late 62 or early 63, I think, gave Castro $53 million in food and medicine in exchange for the return of the 1,113 prisoners remaining from the Bay of Pigs invasion. So a massive fuck up, and hugely embarrassing for the CIA in that they had just been repelled by, this guy they were making fun of as the propped up, Soviet puppet dictator of a banana republic. That their secrecy and might and clandestine power and ability to get things done in the shadows and to work miracles in the dark. No, it just completely fucking failed. And it also turned JFK permanently against the CIA because they fucking lied to him. He made a number of comments directly related to the Bay of Pigs, some of them right afterward. He told Ben Bradley, this is a quote, "The first advice I'm going to give my successor is to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn." Multiple people quoted JFK as saying something like, "I want to shred the CIA into 1,000 pieces. I want to set fire to the CIA and scatter its ashes to the winds." I think the import is pretty clear. And in the second half of 1961, JFK did several things that, if they had been paid attention to, if they had been followed, would have changed the rest of world history enormously, almost more than it's possible to imagine. And the first of those was something he did on June 28th, 1961, so just over 2 months after the failed invasion. JFK authorized National Security Action Memoranda numbers 55, 56, and 57. And what these did was to take away all CIA jurisdiction over covert and clandestine operations and put those operations instead under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, meaning that every kind of covert activity would go through the chain of command of the executive branch straight to the president himself, who would know everything about every aspect of it, and that the CIA would be returned to what it was, in theory, originally supposed to be, just an organization that gathers intelligence and presents it to other people. No fucking secret wars, no deposing democratically elected leaders, no crack epidemic. I mean, Jesus Christ. No, in all probability, Vietnam, at least in the way that we got Vietnam, and we're going to talk a lot about Vietnam later in this episode, because Vietnam was many things to many people, and the CIA and ARPA angle has been sorely underemphasized there. I mean, Jesus Christ, think of a world in which the CIA is not allowed to plan its own clandestine operations. For that matter, we didn't even talk about this in the episode about CIA history. No Afghanistan 1980, in which we give the Mujahideen $1 billion fucking dollars, in which we help Osama bin Laden create the network that we will eventually start calling Al-Qaeda, although there is good reason to think that we, for a long time, grossly exaggerated the size and power and extent of Al-Qaeda. And no first Gulf War, because another fact that nobody remembers, nobody cares about, it's on paper, it has been published in non-controversial places. Some of you who remember that period in time may remember that our reason for going into Iraq the first time under George H.W. Bush was allegedly that Saddam Hussein had used sarin gas against the Kurds. Well, it has been proven, and I mean proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the CIA both sold Hussein that gas and told him when and where to use it in Iraqi Kurdistan. Because let's not forget, Saddam Hussein was our boy for the early 1980s. Through the whole Iran-Iraq war, after the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979, Hussein was our guy keeping Iran in check, basically fighting our wars for us, and did some of the things he did, including the incursions into Kurdistan, basically as a way of getting himself paid back for the massive debts and expenditures that he had incurred fighting American wars on America's behalf. So that wouldn't have happened. And then I think we all, I hope anyone listening to this is old enough to remember the CIA's role in the second Afghan and Iraqi wars, the ones that are still going on, to say nothing of Syria, to say nothing of Libya, to say nothing of on and on and on and on. The three memos that JFK issued on June 28th, 61, could and should have prevented all of that from happening. They could have built a different world. The world we have had since 1961, or really since the end of World War II, and particularly since 1953 when Dulles took over the CIA, the world of endless, covert U.S. militarist expansion, the world of endless neo-imperialism, the world of endless American-centered capitalism, spread first by force and then by, supposedly softer sorts of politics, that might all be different. We cannot even imagine the world that we might live in if those orders had been followed. But the problem with giving an order to an organization like the CIA is that about 90% of their work has to do with lying. So if you give them that sort of order, they're just going to lie and pretend that they're following it. They'll say, oh, yeah, sure, we'll report all clandestine and covert activity to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and you will have final approval, Mr. President, sir. And then, of course, not do that. And in this instance, I don't think they even bothered to bullshit Kennedy about it. I think they just didn't do anything. They just pretended that this had never happened and went on planning to depose Castro because they were still obsessed with that. So after several months of this, these orders, having the force of law being in effect and nothing changing, Kennedy decides to do the second basically unthinkable thing of his presidential tenure, which is to fire Allen Dulles in November 1961. Now, those national security action memoranda, those might have been enough on their own to get Kennedy killed by the CIA. Firing Allen Dulles was definitely enough to get Kennedy killed by the CIA. Allen Dulles was, there's really no good comparison for him in modern politics because, we've gotten used to CIA directors changing every 2 years because they get embroiled in some scandal. But Dulles at the time was a J. Edgar Hoover-like figure who, he'd only been there for, one administration, but there was never any question that Kennedy was going to retain him as director of Central Intelligence because everyone would have retained him. Dulles was the fucking éminence grise of the American intelligence world. The idea of firing him, it was like, firing Rasputin or some shit. Firing someone who sits behind the throne, knows where every body is buried, and is perfectly capable of converting you into a body if you should fuck with him too egregiously. So firing Dulles, that would have been more than enough to set the CIA on its ear for years afterward. But then Kennedy followed up by firing General Charles P. Cabot, who was the deputy CIA director in January 62, and after him firing Richard Bissell, who was the co-director of the National Reconnaissance Office of the CIA, in February 1962. The two guys who were next in line after Dulles and who were best prepared to carry out, the Dulles plan for the world of endless coups and invasions until the entire world was safe for American capitalism and we could have a nuclear war with Russia or wait for the Soviet Union to crumble. Cabot especially, he was Dulles's right-hand man. He was more than ready to pick up where Dulles left off. So, you know, firing Dulles, it wasn't, but it could have been, you know, a ceremonial sort of dishonor thing about what a fuck up the Bay of Pigs was, that, you know, the CIA director, whoever he was, he was going to have to step down after that. But getting rid of Cabell and Bissell, that was a clear sign that Kennedy was saying, fuck your entire agenda. I want nothing to do with any of this. And after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy still sort of let the CIA plot in private about various anti-Castro activities, but he would not give them permission to do anything. Every time they came to him with a plan, he said, no, 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 no. So they started not coming to him with their plans. And the most notable plan with which they did not come to John Kennedy was Alpha 66. The group I mentioned is formed by David Atlee Phillips, a.k.a. Maurice Bishop, the scariest motherfucker in the CIA after Dulles. And now that Dulles is gone, probably the scariest in general. And this was a group, much like the Bay of Pigs invasion force, that consisted largely of anti-Castro Cuban exiles, almost all of whom were CIA assets already, but, you know, if they weren't, became CIA assets via Alpha 66. And they undertook a series of what you would have to call terrorist acts, little raids on the Cuban coast. You know, sometimes it just involved shooting at coastal installations of various sorts, sometimes sneaking onto the mainland and murdering people. And the thing about Alpha 66 is that they were not quiet. They were not clandestine. Alpha 66 would call the AP and Reuters and say, we're going to have a press conference about the great work we're doing to try to free Cuba, which was a direct provocation from David Atlee Phillips and thus from the CIA to Kennedy. I mean, no bigger fuck you than to call, you know, the news services and brag about how, yeah, you know, Kennedy won't give us permission, but still, we're fighting the good fight even when our president is too weak. And, you know, I have already talked at some length about Kennedy's relationship with death. He had a very bleak sense of humor. He's actually a really funny guy in an extremely grim way. And at some point around this time, I don't know how he got involved in a conversation about military coups, but he did. And someone asked him, you know, do you think a military coup would be possible in the United States? And he said, there won't be a coup here. For that, you'd need a young president with military opposition and a Bay of Pigs type event. He knew full well what the fuck was going on. And if he knew after event number one, you know, the Bay of Pigs and then those national security memos, which are the thing you really got to remember, oh God, did he know after number two, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And presumably you've all had to read in, you know, high school history textbooks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I'm not going to belabor the thing itself. But basically, American recon discovered that there were Soviet missiles in Cuba. And from October 16th through 28th, 1962, there was this massive standoff during which, and here's an interesting grammatical point. Usually, we would say, your high school textbooks probably said, during which we were as close to nuclear war as we have ever come. Now, our current political situation, not totally sure that you can say that anymore. I, for one, being of a very sunny disposition, would bet you what money you like that if John Bolton becomes the national security advisor, as it looks like he will, we will use nuclear weapons by 2020, before the 2020 election. I think Tehran is most likely, and I think if we use them in Tehran, we'll probably fuck around and use them in Pyongyang too, because you never use just one. You know, the whole mystique of the nuclear weapon being the absolute last resort, the thing you can't even do. Well, if you've used one, then yes, you can. You can use another one. So, if anyone wants to get a little betting pool going, I will put my money on a nuclear weapon dropped in Iran before the 2020 presidential election. But anyway, back to Kennedy here. There's this, horrifying standoff. People are, perched on the edge of the absolute abyss for almost 2 weeks. Lenny Bruce, actually, a hero of mine, one of the rare people of whom we can truly say he died for our sins. Lenny Bruce had a gig in Florida during part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he was doing 3 sets a day at a hotel there. And at random points throughout his set, Lenny would just stop in the middle of sentences and go, "We're all gonna die," and then collapse laughing on stage. You get an accurate sense of the mood here. Some of you who've read Don DeLillo's Underworld will probably recognize that episode. And that, well, first of all, you should just read Underworld because it's one of the great American novels of the 20th century. It's probably the best non-pinch-on American novel of the later 20th century. But second, the section that takes place during the Cuban Missile Crisis, very, very, very vivid in terms of mood. So the missile crisis ends publicly, officially, when the Soviets agree to withdraw their missiles from Cuba, and we agree to withdraw our missiles from Italy and Turkey. But there were other conditions to this, and other valences, other aspects that weren't public at the time, and that help explain yet further why the CIA wanted Kennedy dead. Number one, Kennedy secretly pledged never to make another attempt to invade Cuba. And, that, of course, to the CIA would have been, after all these ultimate betrayals, the still more ultimate betrayal. But number two, and this is huge, and this is not widely known at all, and the guy I credited before, James W. Douglas, the guy who wrote JFK and the Unspeakable, deserves an immense amount of credit for unearthing all this, as he does for his coverage of what really happened to Martin Luther King, which of course is not the official story. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed John F. Kennedy in a profound way. The Bay of Pigs turned him against the CIA and initiated a power struggle within the American government that was, would have been enough to get him fucking ventilated anyway. But the Cuban Missile Crisis changed his entire world, his entire notion of what he was doing and what his responsibilities were. And from the Cuban Missile Crisis onward, JFK was determined to end the Cold War. And he set up back-channel negotiations with both Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, and Castro to establish some sort of terms of peace between the U.S., Russia, well, the whole Soviet bloc, and Cuba. He wanted this shit over with. He had spent, 13 days staring into nuclear Armageddon and was fucking done with it. And in fact, one of the things that helped to end the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the things that convinced Khrushchev to take Kennedy's offer, you withdraw your missiles from Cuba, we'll withdraw ours from Italy and Turkey, and we'll never invade Cuba, was that JFK told Khrushchev during the crisis, so sometime late October 1962, if we don't resolve this thing, there will be a military coup in the United States. And it's worth thinking in specific terms about what JFK meant here. Because, he was no doubt to some extent talking about the CIA. But let's remember who made up his Joint Chiefs of Staff. one person in particular, a fella named Curtis LeMay. He was the chief of staff for the Air Force. He was also the basis for General Jack Ripper in Doctor Strangelove. You know, Sterling Hayden's character. Communist subversion, communist infiltration, communist fluoridation of our precious bodily essences. That was supposed to be Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a psychopath who had an enormous hard-on for nuclear war. During the missile crisis, he wanted to invade Cuba. He, during the Vietnam War, suggested bombing Vietnam back to the Stone Age. That phrase, bomb X back to the Stone Age, that's Curtis LeMay's phrase. And he, along with the other Joint Chiefs, also advocated at various points during Kennedy's presidency for preemptive nuclear strikes on Moscow, Berlin, and the capital of Laos, which the French call Vientiane, and which the Laotians, if I've got this right, call Yangchan. They wanted him to nuke Germany, Russia, Laos, and Cuba. They were coming to him seriously with these proposals to be the aggressor in thermonuclear war. You know, since I've mentioned Dr. Strangelove, a lot of people, I think, in retrospect, because of the accent and all that, assume that the character of Strangelove himself is based on Henry Kissinger. But Henry Kissinger was not a political celebrity yet in the period that movie is depicting. Strangelove, more than anyone else, was based on this guy named Herman Kahn, who wrote a book of which the thesis was essentially, you would think in apocalyptic thermonuclear war, both sides would lose. But actually, you can be the winner of apocalyptic thermonuclear war if you just follow these easy steps. A book that basically proposed, that you could win Armageddon, that there was a good kind of Armageddon. This sort of thought was, being taken seriously while Kennedy was president. It was clearly filtering up into his Joint Chiefs, most notably that evil son of a bitch, Curtis LeMay. And after he left the service, LeMay was probably most notable for being the vice presidential running mate to George Wallace in 1968 on the American Independent Party ticket, which was basically on the platform of resegregation after the famous Civil Rights Act, not the 57 one, the one everybody remembers from the mid-60s. And my favorite fact about this, the best thing I discovered in the course of research, was that George Wallace didn't originally want Curtis LeMay to be his vice president. He wanted Colonel Sanders to be his vice president. So, lovely thing to know that you were the second choice behind Colonel Sanders. This is the kind of opposition Kennedy is facing even from within his own administration, people telling him to start nuclear wars. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was absolutely determined, we are going to end this shit before, Armageddon occurs. And he and Khrushchev eventually got to trust each other more than either of them trusted their respected governments, which were busy undermining all the time. And Kennedy didn't get to meet face-to-face with Castro, but he had various couriers and messengers. And he explicitly told Castro that though he, wasn't a communist and couldn't agree with communist ideology, he supported the ideals of the Cuban Revolution and understood completely why they had to get rid of that son of a bitch Fulgencio Batista. Kennedy was doing everything he could to stop this before the nightmare that was drummed into everybody's heads for 50 fucking years, and is starting to get drummed into them again. You'll notice we care about nuclear weapons again in a way we didn't used to. And this question of ending the Cold War, we have to look here at what JFK was jeopardizing. Because we've already talked about the Cold War in general as the ideal political economy for a certain kind of evil shyster that, in terms of spending, in terms of military action, in terms of covert assassination or invasion or a replacement of foreign governments, the Cold War is the ideal justification for any and everything, because it has no shape, it has no face, it has no locus. You can claim it's behind everything because no one knows quite what it is. That book I mentioned, for example, by Claire Sterling, The Terror Network, claiming that the Soviet Union was behind every terrorist act on Earth. So there is that in general. Kennedy is endangering the whole ripe field of the Cold War future. I mean, hogs in shit as far as, the CIA and the military and defense contractors and war hawk politicians go. They couldn't have asked for a better world. But apart from Cuba, the thing Kennedy was most endangering right then was a thing that we have come collectively to call the Vietnam War, which we really shouldn't. That's really not accurate. Calling it the Vietnam War is a not so subtle way to get around talking about the things we did in nearby places, both before and after the Vietnam War. It should really be called, the American War in Southeast Asia, something along those lines, because it was a war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in which Vietnam ended up having the heaviest fighting, the most notable casualties, and so forth. But Laos and Cambodia were deeply involved. In fact, Laos was involved first. As early as the late 1950s, the CIA was running a program in Laos called Project Hotfoot, later changed its name to, I believe, Operation White Star. The deal here was that Lao, and I'm calling it Lao. I understand that people outside it usually call it Laos, whereas the Laotians themselves call it Lao, so I'm calling it Lao. Anyway, Lao had won something like independence from France in one of the Indo-Chinese wars, and was internally riven by the struggle between the right-wing Laotian royalists and the left-wing, or I should say full-on communists, Pathet Lao. So naturally, we were going to arm and train the right-wingers, and we sent people over there to bulk up and to educate in the ways of American warfare, the Royal Lao Army. We financed this operation because the CIA, as I have not ceased to insist, is always looking for a way not just to pay for itself, but to turn a buck. We financed a whole lot of this operation with heroin, because a lot of the Laotians that we were trying to induct into the Royal Lao Army were of an ethnic group called the Hmong. And the Hmong live in very isolated regions, far enough away from any sort of central government that the idea of government-issued papered currency isn't very meaningful or relevant to their lives. So one of the major media of exchange among them was opium poppies. And we very quickly figured out, holy shit, there is an unbelievable amount of heroin here. And we can get them to pay us in heroin. We're here working for our government, quote unquote, but we can extort fees from them and extort them in the form of heroin and then ship that shit back to the United States and make an enormous profit. And one of the reasons from the late 50s to the mid-70s that the CIA did not want the war in Southeast Asia to end was that, god damn, it was bringing a lot of heroin in. And you read any literature of the period, especially of the later 60s, you will notice writer after writer talking about the turn from drugs like marijuana or, amphetamines, 50s drugs like bennies or dexedrines or whatever, to then, acid or mushrooms or peyote, to, by the end of the 60s, heroin. And you will read a lot of talk about people getting involved in heroin thinking that it's, no better, no worse than something like pot. and very quickly getting horrifically addicted. And then you will read Ehrlichman talking about the war on drugs, admitting that it was an excuse to target black people and leftists, and saying specifically that part of the war on drugs propaganda aim was to weld the idea of heroin addiction to the idea of black people, and especially black nationalists. You got all that heroin in the counterculture and heroin as a government weapon against black countercultural groups. And then you've got the CIA for over 15 years bringing in enormous shipments of heroin, making it a popular drug all up and down the West Coast in a way it really, well, I should say on a level it really hadn't reached before. You can call that, accidental if you want, or coincidental. I have a hard time seeing it that way. And I will never forget reading about ostensibly a Pepsi Cola factory in, I believe it was Laos. It may have been Cambodia, but I believe it was Laos, in which the CIA had, taken over all the processing facilities, and they were still bottling Pepsi Cola there. But what they were also doing was amassing the corpses of dead American soldiers and scooping out their internal organs and filling their abdominal cavities with heroin. So apparently you can fit about 40 or 50 pounds of heroin inside the average adult male corpse if you pack it tight enough. And then sending these corpses home in body bags. And someone, presumably also from the CIA, on the other side would slit the corpses open again and retrieve the heroin. And that's how a substantial amount of horse got into the United States during the Southeast Asian War. This is the sort of image that I want to remain with you when we talk about this Southeast Asian War. Because the Vietnam War, I mean, really the two sort of TV wars are World War II and the Vietnam War, right? And we've talked about World War II already, how that's the last war in which we can pretend to moral legitimacy, which is horseshit. And I will talk, especially when we get through with this JFK business and I talk about Gravity's Rainbow. Oh man, is it horseshit for Americans to pretend to any moral decency in World War II. But, it fits the bill in terms of producing movies and TV shows and books and whatever. And of course, the Nazis were so mythologically, self-consciously evil. We're so invested in this iconography of evil that they're the perfect villains. And then the other TV war is what we call the Vietnam War, because we love to rake it over again and again and again, sort of pretending to have understood it, and paradoxically also wallowing in our confusion. A million shots of tenured academics saying, well, the Vietnam War, to me, seems like the time when America lost its moral direction. Fucking thanks, right? Moral direction was one of our real characteristics before that. And, you play The End or White Rabbit or the guitar solo from 8 Miles High, and you show guys in helicopters. Any white rock music that's vaguely raga influenced. And then you have to balance the veterans, right? You get one veteran who says, it was the most horrible goddamn thing I've ever seen, and I don't know why the fuck we were there, man. And then another guy who says, well, they wouldn't let us win. We were doing everything we goddamn could, but those ungrateful Vietnamese, they weren't even interested in winning, and our fucking government wouldn't let us win. And then you just leave it there as if you've said something. That's what the recent bullshit Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War did. That's what virtually every Vietnam retrospective does. And it is, as I have already said, significant that they always talk Vietnam, 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 and not a 15-plus year operation all over Southeast Asia that involves, among other things, heroin trafficking. But even more important than the heroin trafficking was a specific, let's call it, historical role
assigned to the Southeast Asian War, almost from the very beginning, which was that unlike any other previous war, the war in Southeast Asia, and especially the war in Vietnam, was going to be a technocratic war. It was going to be a war run by expertise, by data analysis, by specialization. And there was an incredible amount of money involved in all kinds of different fields. To anyone who claimed that his or her supposed expertise could give us some kind of datum that would help us win this goddamn war. You know, you think of Robert McNamara at the Department of Defense and his famous whiz kids. You know, people who didn't come from any military hierarchy, people who came from business and academia and shit. And Vietnam basically saw the invention of the pseudoscience of what we call counterinsurgency. You know, you may have noticed that we have now been studying and refining our theories of counterinsurgency for what, call it 58 years, more or less. We have yet to defeat an insurgency, ever, anywhere. They don't get defeated. We have never gone in to a place like Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos and successfully suppressed its insurgency. Counterinsurgency is fucking bullshit. It's not real. But it is one of the greatest grafts of all time. If you are a technocrat who doesn't mind spinning shit, counterinsurgency is an incredibly rich field for lies and pseudo-truths and meaningless paradoxes and the collection of information that's supposed to demonstrate something but doesn't. Counterinsurgency is where you want to be. I mean, ask anyone who works at one of the big, national security think tanks, endlessly producing papers about nothing, endlessly producing new terminology, new jargon that says nothing. I mean, I think of that great genius, Sebastian Gorka, and what was it? There was a graph in one of his counterinsurgency papers where it was a two-headed arrow, and on one side of the arrow it said peace, and then underneath the arrow it said terrorism, and then on the other side it said like nuclear holocaust or something like that. This is the level that we're talking about. So the war in Southeast Asia did not just produce money for defense contractors in the usual sense, basically arms dealers and people involved in the logistics of transporting and maintaining and using arms. It was hiring psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, pharmacologists, logicians, systems theorists, cyberneticists, computer scientists, cognitive philosophers, all of whom had a million contradictory and flimsy-ass theories about how to penetrate the mind of the Viet Cong. Not just how to win an individual military engagement, but how to get into the soul and the psyche of the Vietnamese rebel. All of which, again, is just fatuous horseshit. I mean, all of which completely discounts ideas like they were colonized and didn't want to be colonized anymore, and now we're trying to recolonize them and they don't want that either. No. It's got to be about some profound point of psychic subtlety that will help us overcome them. So, the money now, it's not just going to Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon and all the other devils of the earth, No, it's going to the Rand Corporation and to Harvard and Yale and MIT and Princeton and Dow and Monsanto and IBM and Western Electric, Bell Laboratories. And it behooves us at this point to talk about ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, now called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was founded right around the same time the war in Southeast Asia started, which is to say the late 50s Cambodia. And ARPA, though it's part of the Department of Defense, operates essentially like a private corporation. It's the most shadowy, sketchy, frightening part of the DoD. Some of you probably know the rapper LP. He's now famous from the group Run the Jewels. And he once said, at any given time, there is a two-man team in some dark corner of DARPA that is 5 years away from creating a fully functional dragon. And that's the way to think of DARPA/ARPA. And ARPA was huge in this drive to turn war into a technocracy, and huge in various pre-war projects that presaged that shift, because the essential rationale of ARPA was that we needed smart war, we needed technological war. So ARPA, for example, was involved in a little thing called Operation Argus. Some of you who, know history, and maybe, I don't know if I have any listeners who are actually old enough to remember this, but if I do, what's up? Some of you may remember when we started testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere instead of on the ground, with the rationale that it was safer. We fucking knew it wasn't safer. Of course it's not safer. We were never under the impression that it was safer. No. The reason we started testing them in the atmosphere was that ARPA came up with the idea that by detonating nuclear warheads up in the ionosphere, we could create a radiation belt that would destroy enemy transmissions and fry the electronics in enemy missiles. So in this thing called Operation Argus, we detonated a bunch of fucking nuclear weapons just up in the sky, pretty near the boundary to outer space, with the idea that it would jam Russian radio transmissions. And there was a test ban shortly after this. Argus was 1958. But a few years later, the moratorium got lifted. So 1962, ARPA does a thing called Project Fishbowl. Exactly the same shit. Blowing up nuclear weapons in the atmosphere because we think it can create a veil of secrecy. All of which is just not just wrong in the ethical sense, or dangerous, or incredibly mendacious, but stupid. There's a very, very high quotient of stupidity here. And ARPA was also behind a little thing in Southeast Asia called Project Agile. Now, anyone who knows anything about Vietnam knows about Agent Orange. The defoliant that we sprayed everywhere reduced just obscene amounts of usable, healthy land in Vietnam to fucking scrub wasteland with this chemical. It is less known that Agent Orange was just part of a line that also included agents white, blue, pink, and purple, and that all of these defoliant agents were only one part of an ARPA program called Project Agile that was a chemical weapons testing program. Because we knew that no one was going to care about what happened to the fucking Vietnamese, I mean, to a large degree, no one even cared about what happened to our own soldiers there. So, sure, you had chemical weapons to test. Southeast Asia, it's golden. It's an open land. You will never get in trouble for any of it. So, sure, use the pretext that you're trying to clear the jungle to make fighting war easier, and then just test whatever the fuck you want. And there was, it is perhaps needless to say at this point, heavy CIA involvement in all the humanities research that went into counterinsurgency via ARPA. And in the data collection processes that ARPA fed into a little thing I've mentioned before in the Pinch-On episodes called ARPANET. We'll get back to ARPANET in a minute. It's very important, but chronologically, we need to do a couple other things first. So you've got the Southeast Asian War already going in the late 50s in Laos, right? And by 1961, JFK and Khrushchev had agreed to neutrality in Laos officially. the CIA continued its secret war there until 1973, under, if I recall correctly, a Mr. Ted Shackley, formerly the chief of the CIA station in Miami, big player at JM Wave, Zenith Technical Services, all that. So all of this is to say that Kennedy, in trying to end the Cold War, is jeopardizing not just the Cold War project in general or the Southeast Asian War in particular, but this entire enormous conversion of war into a technocratic enterprise that was going to make so much money for so many people. And Kennedy, of course, if he wants the Cold War to end, he's not going to encourage hostilities in Vietnam. Outwardly, he kept sort of towing the line, saying very vague things about, we must not let our priorities in Vietnam be deterred by communist presence. Just sort of mouthing the necessary pieties. But behind the scenes, Kennedy wanted nothing to do with a war in Vietnam or Southeast Asia in general. And as I believe I mentioned before, when he was a congressman in 1951, Kennedy took a fact-finding trip there shortly before the First Indo-Chinese War, in which he and Bobby, who went with him, both came to the conclusion fighting a war in Vietnam would be absolute fucking suicide. But the CIA, they knew that the Southeast Asian War, it wasn't just one more war against the alleged specter of communism. I mean, obviously it was that. Obviously it was partly about spreading American dominion even further, but there was this whole immense translation to the realm of the technocratic. So the CIA was not going to let this go. And one of the things that Jim Douglas documents with pinpoint accuracy is the fact that the CIA betrayed Kennedy over and over and over in Vietnam, trying to provoke hostilities. You have all, I'm sure, seen photos or film of the monk setting himself on fire. Well, that monk set himself on fire in June 1963 to protest the fact that Buddhism was being suppressed in Vietnam by the private army of Ngo Dinh Khanh, who was the one of the brothers of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Khanh was extremely Catholic and forbade any public displays of Buddhism. And in May 1963, some Buddhists demonstrated against that edict forbidding public displays and were shot down by Khan's troops. That is why that monk burned himself in June 63. The people who gave Ngo Dinh Khan's troops the go-ahead to shoot the Buddhist protesters, that was the fucking CIA. That the word came directly from them. You're fine. Go ahead. Do it. And perhaps most importantly, the CIA was directly responsible for the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president, a man whom Kennedy didn't particularly like, but for whom he felt responsible because, after all, the United States had helped put him and his family in this horrible fucking situation. And when it became clear to Kennedy that Ngo wasn't going to last as the president of Vietnam, he made it sort of a personal mission to at least get the guy and his family out of there safe before he was murdered. And there are two people who are particularly important in this story of the CIA helping rival Vietnamese generals kill him and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. And their names are Averell Harriman and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., two world-class sons of bitches. Averell Harriman, man of many trades, wore many hats, sort of a professional world diplomat, helped start Brown Brothers Harriman, which if I'm not mistaken, was the first private bank in America, completely private. And last I looked, had control of assets equaling about $4 trillion. He himself died with a fortune of about 225 million in modern dollars. And from 1961 to 1965, he was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was in Vietnam. And Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., the guy whose Senate seat Kennedy took, he was the ambassador to South Vietnam. So they're both there during the lead up to the war. The CIA is prodding, and Kennedy is trying to figure out, what can I do to stop this from popping off? And the go-ahead order to kill Ngo Dinh Diem and Ngo Dinh Nhu came from the CIA to a set of rival Vietnamese generals. The order to the CIA may have come from Averell Harriman. There's evidence to suggest that. One unnamed diplomat complained that Harriman is trying to run this goddamn war by himself. And when that plan was given to the rival Vietnamese generals, they went to Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. and said, really? Can we do this? And Cabot Lodge gave, quote-unquote, secret assurances that the U.S. would not interfere if they attempted to assassinate the Ngo brothers. And that assassination, of course, led to the virtual collapse of any plausible, U.S.-backed South Vietnamese government and the Vietnam War proper. But it didn't need to go that way. It didn't have to. And in fact, Kennedy, though he couldn't stop the murder of the Ngo brothers, he had already started to kind of hedge his bets against this possibility. I mean, obviously he could see it coming. He knew as well as anybody what the CIA wanted in Southeast Asia. So here's another thing that was probably sufficient to get him killed. Another one of those National Security Action Memoranda, NSAM number 263, which withdrew the first 1,000 troops from Vietnam. That was September 1963. He wanted out. In fact, as I've mentioned before, the day before he was assassinated, he told a confidant, and I'm still not sure if it was Pierre Salinger or not. I think it was. Vietnam is not worth one more American life, and that he would have all American troops out of Vietnam by the end of 1965 after he was reelected. So that starts in September 1963 with National Security Action Memo 263, which withdrew the first 1,000 troops. Read into it what you like, that Lyndon Johnson, of course, becomes the president on November 22nd, 1963, as soon as Kennedy is assassinated. The next day, he issues National Security Action Memo number 273, which calls off National Security Action Memo number 263. It says, no, the 1,000 troops are staying there. I don't necessarily draw any conclusions from that about LBJ's possible complicity in the assassination. I have no idea, as I've said before, but clearly once he was the president, he was their man. He knew how to play ball. Now let me step aside just for a moment from the specific timeline of Kennedy and the CIA in Vietnam to talk about a program that actually hadn't started yet by the time Kennedy died, but was one of the things that wouldn't have happened if Kennedy had managed to survive and end the war in Southeast Asia, to say nothing of dismantling the fucking CIA. A thing called the Phoenix Program ran from 1965 to 1972, primarily in Vietnam, and it was a CIA overseen project with various other agencies involved, including the RAND Corporation. And its purpose was to capture, interrogate, quote unquote, meaning torture, and then either flip or kill people considered Viet Cong. And by flip, I mean, either bring them over to our side explicitly or turn them into rats, turn them into snitches. As we well knew, I mean, this would have been absolutely clear to us by this point, if nothing else, because exactly the same thing had happened with the word communist in Haiti. The term Viet Cong, once we made it clear that we would arrest and torture and very probably murder anyone who you called Viet Cong, people just started calling each other Viet Cong because they were pissed off. Neighbors had a dispute. My neighbor is Viet Cong. So it produced virtually nothing in terms of, usable information because people were just denouncing each other left and right. What it did do was, and put some big quotation marks around this one, neutralize 82,000 people. We know for a fact that about half of them, 41,000, were murdered. We'll probably never know how many of the other half were murdered, but, probably a lot, given the nature of the program and of the CIA in general. And I mentioned ARPANET earlier. One thing that is particularly important about the Phoenix program was that it was a major early audition for ARPANET. And credit again here to Yasha Levine, and you ought to go read his book, Surveillance Valley. He talks about the military mythology that ARPANET was developed to have some kind of command and control network left in case of a nuclear strike. And that's partly true, but ARPANET from the beginning was also engaged in counterinsurgency. And they deployed it to collect and analyze data in places like Vietnam, and then they brought that technology home and started using it on us. And in fact, personnel from the Phoenix program later did counterinsurgency work on groups they considered insurgent, obviously, inside the United States. And someone from the Phoenix program may well have been involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. That's a whole other topic, and, I have to make it a qualified statement and so forth. But the inarguable point, the thing that I don't have to hedge my bets about, is the statement that personnel from the Phoenix program later came home and did here what they did in Vietnam. And as a final point on this whole Southeast Asian war thing, right off the coast of Vietnam, Indonesia, another place that was occupying the mind of the CIA in particular at this point, because the president of Indonesia is a fellow named Sukarno, who ran an odd form of government, a kind of semi-despotic autocracy that also included popular voting under certain circumstances. It's difficult to describe, and I don't know that it has any particular analogs anywhere else. But over the course of the early 1960s, Sukarno had been moving further and further left, getting closer and closer to the Indonesian Communist Party, because both the Indonesian Islamists and the Indonesian military were making noises about deposing him, with some help from the CIA. And one of the last things JFK did before he was murdered was decide that he was going to make an official state visit to Indonesia to signal his support for Sukarno's shift to the left. To say, look, I'm not a communist, obviously, but given the circumstances he finds himself in, there's nothing else for him to do here. And Kennedy never got to do that. And because he never got to do that, in part, the CIA collaborated with an Indonesian general named Suharto to overthrow the Sukarno government. And no one knows exactly how many casualties there were, but between just 1965 and 1966, one fucking year, it is possible that the CIA helped Suharto murder 3 million people. 3 million in 1 year. And when we talk about statistics coming out of things like coups that establish military dictatorships, probably safe to bet the high end, the CIA helped murder several million people in the course of a year. And if you want some horrific background on that, something really fucking visceral and nauseating, and I mean that in terms of very high praise, you got to go watch a documentary called The Act of Killing about a guy named Anwar Congo, who was a sort of gangster turned paramilitary thug who murdered people for Suharto back then, and via Suharto for the CIA. The CIA was sending Suharto and his murderers lists of people accused of being leftists or communists or subversive or just, anti-militarist in any way. And people like Anwar Congo went out and killed 3 million of them. So, a précis of what was at stake in Southeast Asia, what Kennedy was trying to stop in Southeast Asia. And now we're in 1963, and we got to talk about 2 speeches Kennedy made. The 2 speeches that, to me, define the outward, the public, the exoteric part of his legacy, and that wrench him out of the category of liberal mediocrity in which he spent so much time, at least publicly. And these 2 speeches, I have to imagine, he was only prepared to make because he knew the game was fucking up for him. Death was just around the corner. What can I say? So, in 2 days, June 10th and June 11th, 1963, he came out and made 2 incredible speeches. And the first is often referred to as the American University speech or the peace speech. And in the context of what we now know about not only the CIA, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ARPA and Southeast Asia and the attempt in the Cold War with Fidel and Nikita Khrushchev, we can read this speech as being aimed squarely at his own national security and intelligence apparatus. It is a speech in which he basically begs for peace, but is very careful to specify what he means by peace. Quoting here, "What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave." God damn, imagine an American president saying, "Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war" now. And here is the paragraph in which I most clearly hear him talking straight to his own security apparatus. If I can quote it a little bit of length here. "Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs, and every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home." I probably need not emphasize at this point what it meant for the president in 1963 when Cold War hawkishness was still, the orthodoxy from which one could not deviate. What it meant for him to say that people should examine their own attitudes towards the Soviet Union and the course of the Cold War. And we see exactly the same shit now. The same way Republicans back then convinced, Democrats they needed to out-hawk them on the Cold War. Now Democrats have to out-hawk Republicans on the war on terror, except that they don't, of course. And every once in a while, though it's not American politics, it's pretty analogous, you see someone like Jeremy Corbyn, old Jezza, who will come out after a major terrorist incident and say the thing I've been waiting, 17 fucking years now for someone to say, that the war on terrorism has caused more terror than it's ever prevented, and that this kind of shit will keep happening as long as we keep arming violent extremists in other countries just to spread American hegemony. No Democrat other than, to a certain extent, Bernie Sanders has been willing to say that in the United States. But even Bernie is pretty soft. Bernie, when you ask him about the war on terror, comes out and says, we need to cooperate with our allies in the region, with the King of Jordan, and after Corbyn made his speech, Bernie finally made one sort of along the same lines, but we're really still waiting for that to become, the policy of a fucking president, even just a major party candidate. So Kennedy saying this in 1963 at the heart of the Cold War is amazing. And it's worth noting that a few months before, in March 1963, he had called for huge military budget cuts. Again, who's the last president you remember calling for military budget cuts? Jesus Christ. And then the next day, June 11th of 1963, Kennedy came out and gave his civil rights speech. And there was a very specific context for this that had to do with that piece of shit, George Wallace, Curtis LeMay's future running mate, trying to prevent black university students from going to school. But I read, or rather hear, or both, Kennedy's civil rights speech, and what I hear in it is a man stung by Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Because I know that Kennedy, admired and followed King, but he also had Bobby fucking wiretap Martin Luther King's phone. Pretty emblematic of his record on civil rights up to this point, that he would do both of those things. And Kennedy, as I've mentioned before, very wishy-washy, vacillating, mouthing pieties about progress and tolerance and harmony, and then failing to do much of anything about it on the legislative level. So go back a couple months to April of 1963. Martin Luther King is put in jail in Birmingham for protesting segregation there. And he writes over the course of several days this famous document called The Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And there is a paragraph in it that I think probably anyone who is aware of racial politics and the ongoing hideous legacy of slavery in the United States has cause to recall almost every day. And now when I read this paragraph, I cannot help but think one of the people on King's mind here is John Kennedy. So the paragraph runs, and this is from King's letter from Birmingham jail. It was finished April 16th, 1963. It might have been written any time in the previous few days. He says, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for, quote-unquote, a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And I think of Kennedy hearing that, and that line about shallow understanding from people of goodwill, that had to fucking hurt. And good, it should have. It was absolutely accurate to say of him, if indeed King was thinking of him to some degree. And so Kennedy finally said something that mattered about civil rights in the speech on June 11th, enumerated a long list of indignities and inequalities that black people still suffered despite the previous Civil Rights Act, the one in 1957, the one that he himself had helped gut and no doubt he felt a little pang of guilt about that too. And then asked, and this is remarkable in a way I'll talk about in a minute, asked his audience if they were black, or rather I should say, if we, white America, were black, and here's where the quote begins, who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. And immediately after the speech, he got a telegram from MLK congratulating him fulsomely for having, for the first time for an American president, I should say, made the issue of race in America and segregation in America a moral one rather than a legal one. You know, Kennedy earlier in the speech says this is not an issue of sectionalism or states' rights. It's an issue of morality. And that was not shit presidents said up to that point. Civil rights leaders said it, but presidents did it. And in the course of the speech, Kennedy announced that he was asking Congress to expand the powers of the federal government to enforce civil rights law on the books, and that he was going to pursue legislation that would end public segregation in business and education and increase the protection of voting rights. And this was basically the genesis of the much more famous civil rights law that passed under Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy was murdered. You know, his murder was 99% the CIA and the foreign policy shit, but given the ideological currents that waft through our intelligence community, the civil rights speech probably had something or other to do with it too. He didn't endear himself to any fucking spies with that one. So I mentioned both of these because after talking about his, you know, outward ostensible mediocrity so much, I had to talk about these two profound moments for him before the end of his presidency, and profound publicly, profound for the world to see, rather than profound in the sense of, you know, trying to dismantle the CIA or end the Cold War, of which the public didn't know about. And I want to, just before getting to, you know, the date of his death and the actual assassination, which I'm going to discuss at much greater length and in much greater detail in the next two episodes. One of them will be about Lee Harvey Oswald, and one of them will be about what to me seems like the most plausible narrative of the assassination. I want to discuss one last thing about John Kennedy. You remember the CIA approving the assassination of Goding Ziem and Goding Nu, and how crushed Kennedy was by the fact that he hadn't been able to save them. That was November 2nd, 1963. And Kennedy was, of course, right to feel crushed. He also might have felt lucky that night, if living 20 more days can be considered lucky, because the assassination in Dallas, the one that actually murdered Kennedy on November 22nd, that was not what was supposed to happen. That was not the first attempt. And most people who know anything about the Kennedy assassination, when I mention this, will probably think of Miami. That there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that the CIA was planning some kind of Kennedy hit with Cuban exiles in Miami on the same campaign swing that eventually took him through Dallas. I want to say it was November 16th, 18th, something like that. And then his trip to Miami got canceled because somebody phoned in a reliable tip about the presence of an assassination plot. Yeah, there's that too. Even that was not the first attempt on Kennedy's life, or the first attempt at an attempt, rather. The first serious CIA Kennedy assassination plot was supposed to happen on November 2nd, 1963 in Chicago. The same day Ngo Ding Ziem died, and the Vietnam War, as we later came to know it, sort of, the dam burst. Ngo and JFK were going to be murdered on the same day, and the CIA planned to blame both on communists, though they would have been directly responsible for both. And it was their opinion that that would turn the Cold War hot in one day. The Cold War would become a shooting war. Both the president of the United States and the president of South, which is to say non-communist Vietnam, killed allegedly by communists within a few hours of each other. The world would have lost its fucking shit. And don't forget here that this is not long after JFK has written that national security memo withdrawing the first 1,000 military personnel from Vietnam. So the CIA knows the Vietnam War, the whole Southeast Asian War, is at stake here. And, I mean, how could they possibly state their case for it more forcefully than by murdering the presidents of both the United States and Vietnam and then pretending communists did it? So they got in touch with a guy named Dan Groth. And this is a name to remember with rage. This is one of the most horrible motherfuckers in the recent history of this country. Daniel Groth was outwardly a Chicago police officer, which, is enough. Actually, he was a CIA asset embedded with the Chicago police, and he also did some FBI informing on the side. And they charged Dan Groth, come up with a plan to kill Kennedy in Chicago. Now, you guys who know something about what happened in Dallas, tell me if any of this sounds familiar. Kennedy was going to be in Chicago that day, going to the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field. And there was going to be a big motorcade along city center streets to Soldier Field. And Dan Groth's plan was to have a 4-man sniper team actually shoot at Kennedy from 4 different places along the motorcade route, and then to have a patsy. A patsy who, was an ex-Marine who had CIA history because he was recruited by the CIA while he was serving in Japan, who helped train anti-Castro guerrillas, and who, same week as the parade, somehow gets a job on an upper floor of a warehouse overlooking the parade route? Does any of that sound familiar to any of you? Because if it doesn't, it's exactly the same fucking plan as Dallas. This, to me, is one of the most glaring pieces of proof of a CIA setup. The plan is exactly the same. All of that. I mean, I'll talk about Oswald next time, but all of that shit. Oswald was a Marine. Oswald went to Japan. Oswald was inducted, or rather, unveiled into the CIA in Japan. Oswald got a warehouse job along the parade route just before the assassination. It's the same exact plan. Ooh, pardon. I got me so head up I done hit me a cymbal. The guy they chose was a guy named Thomas Arthur Valley. And the specifics of Thomas Arthur Valley are interesting in how clearly they give the lie to the Oswald story. Because Oswald supposedly killed Kennedy from the left, right? Ideologically, I mean. Oswald was supposedly, a communist and pro-Soviet and pro-Castro. Well, first of all, it makes no fucking sense to kill Kennedy then for being pro-Soviet or pro-Castro. Kennedy refused to invade Cuba, was trying to end the goddamn Cold War. So it's a threadbare-ass story. It is made even more so by the fact that Thomas Arthur Valley, he was going to kill Kennedy from the right. Valley was a member of the John Birch Society, fiercely racist, fiercely right-wing, Second Amendment gun nut, and also, this couldn't hurt, paranoid schizophrenic. So it was just a mirror of what happened in Dallas. The CIA knew full well, oh yeah, just, someone from either side. The actual rifle team, as I mentioned, they were going to be shooting from various other undisclosed locations along the parade route, and they were staying in a boarding house on the north side of Chicago while Valley was getting his job at the warehouse. No one knows who they were. They were eventually chased, but got away. And the only very sketchy information on them suggests that it's possible that there were some of the same mafia-connected people involved in the Bay of Pigs and the eventual successful assassination. But I'll have to tell you who those people were later. So, plans all in place. Daniel Groth has done his job. Why doesn't this happen? Well, complicated story. The FBI gets a tip saying someone is going to assassinate John Kennedy during his motorcade in Chicago. And they ask this person, "Who are you?" And the person will only say Lee. Now, I will explain why next time, because it's a convoluted story, believe me. But I think there's excellent reason to suspect that that was Lee Harvey Oswald. Because I think Oswald, as a planner of the Kennedy assassination, as a definite engineer and architect of it, was beginning to suspect that the wrong person was going to take the fall for it, and that the wrong person might be him. I can't prove, of course, that it was Oswald, but it makes a lot of sense, and I will expand on that in the Oswald episode. What does the FBI do with this tip? Not a goddamn thing. They decide they're not interested in it. They hand it off to the Secret Service, and they say, good luck. Which might have led to Kennedy getting assassinated in Chicago, except for one coincidence of phenomenally small odds involving a guy named Abraham Bolden. Abraham Bolden met John Kennedy just by chance at a JFK campaign event, and Kennedy liked him and made him the first black Secret Service agent to work the presidential detail in the White House. And Bolden had that job for a few months, but quit because he heard other Secret Service agents openly fantasizing about Kennedy's death, talking about how they would get out of the way if somebody shot at him. So he leaves the White House detail, but he gets a job at the Chicago Secret Service, of all fucking places. The FBI hands this tip off to the Secret Service and says, well, do what you want to do with it. And Bolden, who has heard people in the White House talking about killing John Kennedy, thinks, oh, this isn't a fucking joke. So he takes the lead on the investigation, and they find this guy, Thomas Arthur Valley, the Oswald in this attempt, the patsy, who is at this point openly walking around talking about how he's going to kill the president. So, a bit of a problem with choosing a paranoid schizophrenic there. They arrest Valley, and they find the address of the actual shooters, but those shooters, as I've mentioned, get away. When they try to run Valley's license plate, they get a flash back through the system saying this information is available to the FBI only, which, might help explain why the FBI wasn't so eager to investigate an assassination threat. Maybe because Dan fucking Groth, part-time FBI informant, had told them about it, even coordinated with them on it. Even possible that some of the riflemen were FBI. Okay, so Valley gets arrested. The riflemen take off. Obviously, Kennedy is not murdered on that day. Then the real murder happens 20 days later, and Abraham Bolden says, holy fucking shit, this is exactly the same thing. This is the same plot. It has to be the same people doing this. He tries to tell the Warren Commission, hey, I know for a fact the same thing happened in Chicago, and no one wanted to do anything about it. CIA, FBI, nothing. They left it to me. The Warren Commission will not hear his testimony. And shortly afterward, Bolden is set up on a completely phony charge of collaborating with a counterfeiter. He goes to jail. He is subject to psychological torture there. He recalls being told at one point before a doctor drugged him, "When we get done with you, you won't know who you are anymore." His family is attacked while he's in jail. I believe it was that his wife's car was broken into and his house was firebombed, something along those lines. You can check Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, for the details. But in short, Abraham Bolden had his goddamn life destroyed for trying to tell the Warren Commission, hey, this is the second version of the same goddamn plot. Maybe look into the people who were behind the first one. And speaking of the people who were behind the first one, because here death is just around the corner, we always want to end on an optimistic note, right? Daniel Groff, the CIA agent and Chicago Police Department officer who set up this assassination attempt. Well, poor Dan, his plan to kill Kennedy didn't work. But just a few years later, at the behest of the CIA, he was the one who organized and carried out the assassination of Fred Hampton. Daniel Groff commanded the raid by the Chicago Police Department and the officers of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office that drugged Fred Hampton's drink and then murdered him in his sleep. These people last. These people endure, in part because you don't know their names. They stick around. They're always ready for more work. And even if something goes wrong the first time, we trust them, you know. They're reliable. Hey, it wasn't Dan's fault. Who knew Lee was going to call? Who knows who Lee even is? Well, next time here on Death is Just Around the Corner, I'm gonna address that question. Answer would be a little precipitate. Answer would be a little presumptuous. I'm going to address the question of who that Lee was, the fundamental American of the 20th century, Lee Harvey Oswald. And until then, remember, it's between Oswald and L. Ron Hubbard, basically. Those are your pole stars. You pick one to swim toward, and you sort of hope you drown before you get there. So until next time, everybody.